Hey, more lights. Here we go. This one's going to be short, and that's going to please most of you, I'm sure. Hey, if we were in class face to face, we would be in class doing this for 3 hours a week. Okay, so you can handle a couple of 15 to 20-minute videos every 2 days. And if you're lucky, you'll get even more. This is an interesting part of teaching remotely and online is a lot of this would be the same experience if we were in class. You'd be watching me do this on a front computer with a couple of screens on the wall. You guys would be following along, but then it'd be like, well, I can't get the light to work or whatever, and then I'd run over and I'd fix it, whatever, while other students are checking Facebook and stuff like that, and then I get back to where I was on the front computer and try to put it back together. So what's nice on my end is that those distractions aren't there, but what sucks is that those distractions aren't there. Because if you're following along with me on your end on the computer in a different space completely, and you're like, no, I can't get that to work, I'm not there to run over to your machine and fix it. But what's cool is you can just slide that video back and look, what did he click on? Where is that thing? And what did he say? It was command something, and you can kind of try to problem solve that on your own, which makes you a better digital detective and artist. I guess the other thing that just is complicating about remote teaching is that I just don't get to see you guys smile when you turn on a light and see a shadow cast. That's always one of the best parts of being in the same room together. Is there are some moments that we have where all of a sudden things are sort of groundbreaking, components to what we're doing, and I'm only assuming that it's happening on your end. I sure hope it is. Okay, so I'm just kind of picking up where we left off a little bit. I went through a couple undos and brought the camera back to something that was not on top of Bernie anymore, but a little more in front, slight angle. Light is casting on both the floor and the wall. And so now I just want to talk about some of the material attributes of layers and the things that happen in After Effects in the 3D world don't just automatically happen by default, which is a little frustrating. I'm just going to go back to one view just so we can look at the active camera and have lots of space to see this. So we have a spotlight, we have an ambient light. What we didn't do earlier is we didn't turn off the ambient light just to see what the difference is. So if I turn off the ambient light and just rely on the spot, you can see that the change is dramatic. That ambient light is critical. Sometimes the ambient light should only be set to 25%. Because you don't turn on all of the lights in the house if you're trying to light the stage on the theater. You want some of that ambient, and then the rest of this is all going to be dependent upon your other light setups. So think about getting into a habit of always adding an ambient light. I'm looking at Bernie like he's my audience. My audience is up here. It's so funny. I would love to if Bernie was in this class and I'm looking at him telling him how to do After Effects 3D lighting. That'd be hilarious. You're depending on the other lights to do the heavy work. Sometimes you might need more ambient light. It all kind of depends on the circumstance of what environment you're trying to make, what the mood is, how much dramatic effect lighting is going to be as far as what you're trying to accomplish in the story and mood that you're setting. But I'm gonna lower that ambient light down to 25% and just get used to the habit of double clicking on that layer to open up its light settings. That's pretty handy instead of having to go through the little, turn down the what do they call that? I used to know this name and I said it all the time. the twirly-do. And then having to go through all of these things. Fortunately, an ambient light just has 2 settings, intensity and color. Like, that's it. But it is nice to be able to go to the spotlight, let's say, and double click on it, and it opens that up, and you can quickly like do some of your quick adjustments without having to look at a pretty extensive list of things that happen in your timeline window. Real estate is treasured, right? Our screens are only big enough. Mine, fortunately, is a monster. So spotlight, I'm not going to worry about the spotlight right now. The only thing that I want to make sure is set is that it will cast shadows. So that needs to be set to on, because I want to talk about shadows and a few other material options. Layers in 3D space have material options, and that is something that you'll see if you open up a layer that is enabled in 3D. Yes, you have your transform. You'll see something that's grayed out called geometry options, and those are things that you can't do with images. So there's like, no, this is a PNG or a JPEG or whatever. Sorry, Charlie. It only works with text and solids, I think. But we do have material options. And material options, if we open that up, the very first thing is the most important one, and that is cast shadows. So Bernie is in a space where he's reacting to a light. The light is here, it's on him. You can see how it's kind of lighting the floor a little bit. It's definitely lighting the wall. But it's not getting that realistic element, which we would expect when there's a light in the room, to cast shadows. So you have to enable that for layers that you want to see shadows be cast from. Now, this is a tricky button because this button has 3 settings. It has on, it has shadows only. So if you have it set to only, Bernie goes away, but the shadow's still there. It's creepy, kind of, but super helpful for a few other options, we might get to later. Or then just off. So typically you just want it to be set to on. With the shadow set to being on, and you can see it, it's really lovely, right? Now you get a little more understanding of the space that we've created, how far back that wall is, how long the floor is, where the orientation of the light is, and it's cast across the floor and the wall. And this shadow is going to move now if I end up moving. I want to click off of that. Just grab it and do this. So you can see the lower the light gets, the taller the shadow is, and that's what we would expect, right? So talk about dramatic, like as you see the looming shadow behind Bernie, it's pretty intense, or it can just be on the floor itself if the light is high enough. So play around with that for sure. And then obviously the more lateral distance, the longer cast the shadow might be, and etc. So these are all things that our brain registers to immediately. We go right into understanding a definition of what that space is and where we are at as a viewer. And that's really important as we move forward as 3D animators and designers and modelers, that we try to make that human connection to what the perception of your audience is doing in reaction to your artistic intentions. So freaking cool. It's so cool. So the other thing underneath shadows is light transmission. It's set to 0 by default. Generally, that's great. But what if Bernie was stained glass? Then you would increase that light transmission to 100%, which means that the shadow that's being cast is not just blocking light, it's letting light pass through those pixels, and those pixels have color, they have different values, different opacity based on their range of basically black to white. So you can see that I'm casting a shadow that is Bernie. It doesn't make sense in a situation like that, because if he was on this floor in this space, that just wouldn't happen. But there are times when that's really great, especially if you're doing motion graphics work and you've got some text that has cool color to it and you want to like cast some of that color into the space. That's what light transmission is. Accepting shadows is always set to being on, and that's a great thing. We'll see that here in a little bit. And then accepting lights is always set to on. If you turn accept lights off, now since there is no ambient turned on currently, well, I mean, I guess there is. There's 25%. What really happens is we lose. Well, actually, it doesn't even matter if the ambient's on or not because the ambient's a light. We lose Bernie accepting any of that color cast that we've done or perhaps the intensity of those lights that are on there. So there are times when you might want to just turn off the fact that a layer is accepting light, but you want to keep the fact that it is actually casting a shadow and being a player in that room. Your ambient percentage is how much of that light is Bernie really accepting beyond the ambient light. So he'll always accept the ambient light as long as he's accepting lights. But this is more about other lights that are on him. You can diffuse that light, so you can see that as you diffuse or increase or decrease the layer of that diffusion, that changes the way that this works. Specular intensity deals with its highlights and its shadows of the image itself. So sometimes you might want to give a layer a little extra boost. That's cool. Specular shininess will bring out different values of those pixels, whether they're highlights or shadows. And then metal, like if you lower that to 0, it just sort of kind of flattens it, like as if there is no contour or anything like that. It just neutralizes or averages out what shadows and highlights are to become just sort of generalized. So you wouldn't really deal with that too often unless it's a specific material that you're trying to replicate. So there's one light, one shadow. Now if I take, I could do two things. I could just bring in another light and start all over, or I could duplicate this one. So I'm going to duplicate this light. The interesting part of duplicating a light and not futzing with it is that it just kind of increases its intensity. And sometimes that's just a quick way to get an achieved result or desired result. But if I start to move that duplicated light to the left, and notice my point of interest is moving with it, now I'm getting two lights. So you've all been in a kitchen where maybe there's overhead track lighting and there's 3 or 4 different lights and they all cast their own shadow. It's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm now having separate lights kind of doing their same thing, but you can get some different results if I was to back off on one of those or position it on a different side. So you can have a lot of different lights, and ideally the best sculpted worlds that we're dealing with in 3D modeling should mimic what you do in cinematography. So the ideal lighting setup for a film set is like the 3 light scenario where you have your key, your point. Oh man, now I'm just blanking. I don't know what these are called. You have a key light. You've got your 3 lights. Let's just call it 3 lights. That ends up just giving even more of a natural feel to things. So the ambient light is kind of like it's the fill light, key light, and then like secondary key light, or backlight. Backlights don't really work, fortunately, in After Effects. Like I couldn't give him a halo on his shoulders or the back of his hair. It's unfortunate, but ways around it. You can cheat it. So start to just play around with what happens if you bring in more lights. What happens if one of them is just and the keyboard shortcut for a light that gets you directly to its attributes is AA instead of having to see transform stuff. So I could lower the intensity of my secondary lights so it just doesn't cast as much of a shadow. I could change its cone angle so that it's more focused or even more open. But you know, the magical parts are thinking about direction and coupling. Maybe I want to move this one up. Well, I kind of like seeing it, just a little bit of his head on that wall, or maybe it's that's just too creepy. Something like that. It's fine. So like there's three lights. My ambient, I have a key, and then a fill, and they're all the same temperature and color. So the next thing we'll do is we'll look at what happens if you change colors and so on. I also want to address for the next movie, as long as I stay on track, what that 50% gray means as far as lights go. So there you go. Play around with some of those shadows. Enjoy them. They're really fun. And we'll move on. Thanks, guys.